Dear participants, welcome to the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. Our next panel is starting now.
Hello and good evening, Belgrade Security Forum community. We are happy to have you again, and we continue our program after, I believe, a very fitting panel that just ended on the outcome of US elections and how US elections might shape the world and shape Western Balkans, for that matter. We have the privilege of welcoming Professor Cas Mudde, who is the Stanley Wade Shelton Professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia and Professor at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo in Norway. His recent books include Populism, A Very Short Introduction, which has so far been translated into almost 20 languages, and The Far Right Today, which has almost 10 forthcoming translations. He is a columnist for Guardian, US, a regular contributor to Vox Europe, and host of the podcast Radical. Mr. Mudde, welcome. Professor Mudde, welcome to Belgrade Security Forum. We are happy to have you. And please, the Populist Zeitgeist, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind introduction. And if the slides could go up. So today what I want to focus on is pretty much where we are and where we're going. I'm not sure whether people can see the slides though, because so far I cannot see them. So these are going to be my main arguments. We are living in a populist zeitgeist. In the last years, most of the relevant populist actors are far right rather than just populist. The US election will have a massive national and global effects also on the rise and decline of populism. And fourth and final, populism didn't start with Trump and it will not die with Trump either. I don't know which slide we have, but I'm now going to slide 3. What is populism? I'm on the next slide. So populism has many different definitions, and my definition is in line with many other definitions that use populism as a set of ideas. There is debate about whether it's a discourse or a style or an ideology, but for many questions that's actually secondary. So I see populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and entity groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or general will of the people. Now let me emphasize a few points. Populism is both monist and moralist, which means that we're not there yet actually with this slide, but populism is monist in the sense that its key categories, the people and the elite, are seen as sharing exactly the same values and interests. So all the elite have exactly the same interests and exactly the same values. Similarly, all the people have the same interest and values. And the distinction between these categories is on the basis of morals. It's not on the basis of money or ethnicity. It's on whether you are pure and then you're part of the people, or whether you're corrupt and then you're part of the elite. Now we can go to the next slide. So the relationship between populism and politics is a bit more complex than is often understood. So populism is at the same time anti-political and uber-political. It's anti-political in that it denies legitimate opposition. And consequently, it's not looking for compromise because it believes that the other side is elite and therefore corrupt. At the same time, it's uber-political in that it considers everything to be subject to the will of the people. In more simplistic terms, majority rule. And so it doesn't believe that certain things are outside of the democratic realm, the political realm, because they are part of the Constitution or some kind of European Convention of Human Rights. Like every single thing is up, and if the people want to change it, they should be able to. So it's both anti-political and uber-political. We can go to the next slide. So the relationship between populism and democracy is also complex. Simply stated, populism is democracy, but anti-liberal democracy. It accepts popular sovereignty and majority rule, which means people elect their own, the core of democracy. But it's just major aspects of liberal democracy, such as rule of law, separation of powers, and most importantly, minority rights. Now, populist actors can be left or right, depending on what I call the host ideology. Syriza, for example, in Greece, is a left populist party which combines its populism with kind of the host ideology of socialism. The FPÖ, as most far-right parties, combines populism with some form of nativism, xenophobic nationalism. There are only a few exceptions, which is mostly the five-star movement in Italy, which really is just populist and doesn't really have a host ideology. Now, importantly, populism is almost always secondary to the host ideology, which means that to understand Syriza, you need to understand its socialism. To understand Front National, Rassemblement National, you need to understand its nativism. Its populism can only tell part of the story, but it's not an unimportant part of that story. Next slide, please. So I've argued in 2004, at least for the context of Western Europe, that we lived in a populist zeitgeist, by which I meant that populism had become mainstreamed and normalized. This is not to say that all other parties or the media are all fully populist. My argument was that central aspects of populism, for example, that the elite are corrupt or that the people form one homogeneous bloc and can be pleased with policies that are good for everyone in the same way, that these have become mainstream, that these are used not just by populist actors, but also by mainstream politicians, media, and even in low culture, like TV programs. Now, since 2004, populist parties and politicians have increased their support and power well beyond what I had expected, to be honest. And we're even now in a situation where you have a kind of a new divide between populism and anti-populism. And I will talk a little bit more about what anti-populism means and why it's not the solution later on. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the electoral support of populist parties, so of both the left and the right, since the end of the Second World War within the EU countries of last year, so it still includes the UK. So it's the average score of all parties, and what you see is that it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only really in the 1990s that populist parties have started to rise, but the difference between the 2010s and the 1990s is not just that they're twice as successful, but also populist parties today are much more popular in many more countries. So today, a minority of countries does not have a successful populist party. Next slide, please. There it is. It's also important that populism is not a pure European phenomenon. Obviously, we now know that North America has significant populist actors. The United States had in the 21st century Tea Party on the right, and now obviously President Trump. We also have AMLO in Mexico, kind of a populist, although it doesn't fit too well. In South America, we've had left-wing populism with Hugo Chavez starting, then Morales, who his party just returned to Korea. But more recently, of course, all the attention has been on right-wing populism of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. In Europe, we primarily have right-wing populism, and particularly radical right populism. People like Matteo Salvini of the Lega Orban in Hungary, Janša in Slovenia. There are still some left-wing populists, like Mélenchon in France, Demos in Spain, but overall, populism is largely a radical right, not far right phenomenon. And this also implies in Asia and Africa, where overall we don't see too many clearly populist actors, but there are a few, and a few that are particularly important. Obviously, the BJP, which is in power in India. We can also think about Likud and some of its partners in Israel, and then a kind of an interesting, if not as relevant, party, which is the Economic Freedom Fighters, a left populist party in South Africa. Next slide, please. So putting populism in its political context, first of all, populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. Now, what do I mean by that? As I said before, populism is democratic, but anti-liberal democracy. So by and large, it is an extreme form of majoritarianism. So it does believe that the majority should elect their leaders, but they also feel that the majority can do whatever it wants, even at the expense of liberal values and institutions like the rule of law or minority rights. But why is it a response to undemocraticalism? Now, with this, I mean two parts. On the one hand, the much maligned neoliberalism, but on the other hand, also a more cultural and I guess value liberalism. A lot of, particularly since the 1980s, a lot of politics has become more liberal. a lot of policies have become more liberal. However, many of these important policies were never really part of the democratic process. So, for example, in most countries, the death penalty is no longer legal. This is one of the conditions of membership of, of the European Union and other things. However, there are large minorities, and in some countries, majorities, who favor the death penalty. The death penalty has been abolished, most cases, not after a public debate. This wasn't part of an electoral campaign. It was just done, and now it was transformed from a political to a legal issue. Similarly, as a consequence of neoliberalism, much socioeconomic policy has by authoritarian or institutions like the European Union that are several steps removed from the usual political context. It has also led to a consensus of parties, some of the key issues which has led to the politicization of them. The second thing is that while populism feeds off inherent tensions within liberal democracy, as said, on the one hand, majority rule, on the other hand, minority rights. And it also feeds off economic crises or potentially other types of crises, like the Great Recession. Its rise has several causes. It is because of a transformation of societies around the world, secularization, a change in the working class, and its power at the expense of the middle class, which has become much bigger, multiculturalism, but also in a more sense called cognitive mobilization, which means that people have become better educated, and in many countries they also have become more self-confident politically, which means that they have become much more critical citizens. Now, paradoxically, this rise of populism comes at a moment that people are actually becoming more democratic and more liberal than ever before. If you look for particularly at studies about tolerance and appreciation of diversity and those kind of things, the numbers are still not overly encouraging in certain parts, but they're much better than they were 2 to 3 decades ago. Also, a few decades ago, many more people subscribe is the best model. So we have this situation where we have a populist zeitgeist, which plays into illiberal and undemocratic sentiments at a time that actually most of our societies are more liberal and more democratic than they were before. Next slide, please. So the 2020s will be to a certain extent defined by what will happen in 2 weeks here in the US. As has always been the case, US elections are not only important for US politics, but also for global politics. Now, of course, the choice here is between a clear populist, or at least someone who rules as populist, and to be clear, again, a right-wing populist and radical right populist, and someone who stands for the old liberal democratic consensus. When Trump wins, what we will continue to have is tacit support for populists around the world. Now, it's important to note that for all the media hype about a populist international, there is actually no such thing. And except for a few more or less better ties between populist leaders, there is very little international structure. So take Trump, for example. Trump really only has a personal connection, if at that, with Nigel Farage in Britain, who is now not that relevant anymore. Yes, he has done some events with Modi, but there's no structural relationship between the Republican Party and the BJP. There are closer ties between people in the Republican Party and Likud in Israel. But again, there is no international compute, a socialist international, no idea, there's no overt support of Trump for populist actors. He has indicated that he would have preferred Marine Le Pen over Macron, but he didn't come out in support. He didn't do anything material. So we will continue this tacit support, which incidentally has one not so much covered aspect, and that's a normalization of the far right. When you have arguments made by the far right also being made on an almost daily basis by the most powerful person in the world, moreover, the leader of what is still seen as the oldest democracy or the strongest democracy in the world, then that normalizes it. Right? When the US president says something, then it can't be that crazy, that it can't be that extreme. And so simply by having Trump there normalizes radical right arguments and actors. But there's also the story of the US ambassadors. And so, as most people will know, most or many US ambassadors are personal to / political appointees, not so much based on any particular knowledge. It has more to do with how much you have donated to the president. And this is not specific to Trump or to the Republican Party. It's very common. But some of the US ambassadors have been particularly friendly towards radical right parties or have tried to mainstream and normalize them. This applied to the former ambassador, US ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, but it applies in particular to the US ambassador to the Netherlands, Piet Hoekstra, who has spoken at a party meeting of the radical right populist Forum for Democracy, allegedly even organized a fundraiser for that party at the embassy. And of course, the US ambassador to Hungary has played a major role in protecting Orban. Now, if Biden comes to power, he will not just probably go back to a much more vigilant policy that the US had pretty much for decades, but definitely also under Obama. But because of the struggle in the US of liberal democracy versus right-wing populism, he will take that struggle abroad. He has already indicated in his campaign that he will stand up to Orban in Hungary, to PIS in Poland, undoubtedly to Bolsonaro, etc., etc. So that will have an effect. The other effect is that the media is undoubtedly, they've already written these headlines, declare populism dead. If Biden wins, and particularly if the polls are correct and Biden wins large, then all the media are going to say that populism is dead and that this is going to play out. Now, that in itself doesn't have to have an effect, but it could be. It could have. Politics is a bit feeble. It's a bit like the market. It's a lot about hype and about mood. And over the last decades, many mainstream politicians have felt that the momentum is with the populist and that they couldn't really do anything about that. If the media narrative changes, this is an opportunity for mainstream parties to no longer all the time respond to populist claims and reclaim the political agenda. Now, the question is, how long-lived is that going to be? Because we have some important elections in Europe The first one probably being the Dutch in March. And that is going to lead to a clear victory of Rutte, who probably is perceived as a mainstream politician, but at the same time also a record score result for the far right, for the right-wing populist in the Netherlands, who are currently polling at about over 30 seats, so at between 20 and 25%. Now, is there a COVID effect? This is one of the questions being asked the whole time, or just asserted that there is an effect. With regard to the European radical right parties, so the right-wing populist parties, at least until during the first wave, so roughly until August, there wasn't. On average, right-wing populist parties lost around 1%. One of the reasons is that right-wing populism and populism in general is very diverse. Some are in power, some are in opposition, some are the main opposition party, some are a coalition partner. Some populists have completely ignored or downplayed COVID, like, of course, Trump and Bolsonaro, but others have been pretty vigilant, like Modi, for example, Orban at the beginning. And so an overall COVID effect is highly unlikely. However, what COVID does is focus the key attention of the political debate on social economic issues and welfare issues. And these tend to overall work not very well for populists, particularly not for radical right populists, who need issues like immigration. Can I have the next slide, please? So I always get asked about solutions, and given that I've been asked about solutions for a few decades now, and I've actually answered these questions, and the situation have only gotten worse, at best what we can say is that I don't have the right solution, or people are not really listening to me. I think that the most important thing is that populism is more the main symptom than the main problem of liberal democracies. When a liberal democracy functions well, populism overall will not be that successful. It becomes successful because there is a lot of resentment about liberal democracy. Now, once it gets to power, it can undermine liberal democracy even more, as we see in Hungary. But in most countries, for the sake of argument, in the Netherlands, if you ban the Party for Freedom and the Forum for Democracy, you will still have a problem. You still have a lot of resentment towards the political system, towards other groups. And that has to be addressed if you want to get rid of or marginalize populism. And so the real question is not how to fight or weaken populism, and in particular the radical right. The real question is how can we strengthen liberal democracy? Because if people believe in liberal democracy, they will not be particularly vulnerable towards populism. And neither anti-populism nor technocracy, which actually go together often, make things better. They actually make things worse. So anti-populism is pretty much just a reverse populism, where you kind of argue that the people are bad, are evil, and the elite are superior. Now, we have seen anti-populist responses, particularly after Brexit, particularly after the Trump election. Even an argument for a second referendum had strong anti-populist elements, but a lot of the anti-populist elements are also anti-democratic elements. If you don't believe, or if you believe that the majority of the people are bad or are evil or incompetent, you cannot be a Democrat. It makes no sense. Why would you let incompetent people decide the future? Now, a similar form is technocracy. Technocracy has exploded during the neoliberal decades, where more and more policies and important decisions are now taken by organizations that are outside, that are kind of independent from politics or from national politics. Think about the EU, but also think about the central bank, all kind of privatization of important sectors. And what that leads to is frustration among the people who are told that in a democracy the people decide, but then in practice it turns out that many of the key issues that they're interested in are outside of the purview. And so to by and large strengthen liberal democracy, we have to repoliticize politics through open ideological debates. And what I mean by that is that pretty much everything should be on the table. And elites, mainstream politicians shouldn't be afraid to discuss them. So one of the things that we often hear is you can't do that because you're in the European Union. Like that's not a response. That's a fact, but it's not a political response. A political response would be we can't do that while being in the European Union. I believe that the benefits of membership in the European Union far outweighs this particular policy. If you disagree, you can lay out why this is so important that we have to give up EU membership. Right? The same for the death penalty. Right? If you can't make the argument that the death penalty is inhumane and should not be in a civilized country, then I don't think it makes much sense to have international membership of an organization be your argument of why things are the way they are. So I believe in a very open ideological debate. I also do not believe that you can't win against populists. It probably doesn't bring much to have an open debate with someone who doesn't take it serious and who lies. But you don't have to debate populists face-to-face, one-on-one to convince people to vote for you. What we're lacking over the last decade or so is actually an ideological debate. Most political parties do not have an ideologically informed vision on European integration, on multiculturalism, on automation, etc., etc. That's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mudde, for this tour de force through modern populism or populist zeitgeist. We thoroughly enjoyed it. I've been picking up questions coming from our audience, and there are three. I will simply read them out because some of them you have already covered. One concerns the characteristics of modern populism, if you agree with the term. Is it going away anytime soon, or is it becoming more present than ever? You have partially answered that question. Have the majority of mainstream political parties adopted populism as the only tool for getting in power? And third question is, we talk of more political polarization all the time. Is there potential for violence, or better to say, when does polarization transform into violence? We had an excellent conversation last night here over far-right, mainstreaming far-right extremism. And today we've seen chaotic scenes at Belgrade streets with regard to the Medita Dobar Dan festival, which is taking place every year. Another example of unfortunate polarization our particular society is going through. So please, in no particular order, whichever you want to start from first.
Yeah, I think I have addressed the issue of the key characteristics of populism, but again, let me stress that over the last 5 years in particular, when we had the most discussion about populism, we are talking specifically about right-wing populism, or what I call the far right. And populism is only one part of that agenda. Like, we often talk about a populist response to immigration, but there is not a populist response to immigration. Left-wing populists like Syriza and Podemos are among the most open parties in Europe with regard to immigration. Nativism is the anti-immigration response, and nativism is the core of the far right. Nativism is the reason why most people vote for Trump, for Marine Le Pen. And so while nativism is not part of populism, most of the current political actors, parties and politicians that are successful are not just populist, but radical right populist. Given that populism has structural causes, it will not go away easily. Like, we think too much about populism as a response to a crisis, be it the Great Recession or the so-called refugee crisis, or now undoubtedly coming up, the COVID-19 crisis. But that only amplifies. Structurally, there are conditions which also include a changed media environment that favor populism. I haven't spoken much about the media, but one of the things that helps populism is a shift from public media to private media. Many of the media, in particularly Europe, were connected to either a political party or a church or a trade union. That meant that there was a lot of control over its content. Since 80s, 90s, most media are just businesses, which have a very simple economic driver, which means you need to make money. And what makes money? Scandal. And who provides scandal? Populist. And so as long as you have fairly mediagenic populist, they can work this model, right? And so that is not changing. In fact, the media financial basis of the media is incredibly poor, which means that they're even more driven to get the stories that like people read. And in that sense, like, I don't like to only blame the media. Like, the media doesn't necessarily like populist or radical right populist. The media likes to survive. And so they will write stories that we read. And sadly, we read stories about populists. We read everything about Trump, every scandal about Brexit and Boris Johnson. Right? Now, there's a second element to that: social media. Social media does play a role, but in the large questions, so Trump, for example, Trump didn't win in 2016 because of Twitter. He won because CNN and the New York Times were picking up those stories from Twitter, because most journalists think that Twitter is the real world, which sadly, or actually happily, Twitter isn't. So social media has weakened the power of gatekeepers, but in and by itself, it doesn't have the power to really fundamentally change things. With regard to polarization, I think that's the trickiest part. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate polarization. Polarization is a really, really big problem here in the US. in part because you have a two-party system. Moreover, the risk of violence is massive here because people have AR-15s and semi-automatic weapons. In most West European countries, for all the attention that we give to conspiracy theories and small, loud minorities, the vast majority of the population is not polarized. When there are 50 people in the street who are acting against 5G or like the Corona hoax, it doesn't mean that they represent 5 million people. In many cases, they still represent large, like 10 times as many people, but that's about it. Anti-populism obviously feeds into polarization, which is one of the reasons why we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't go in a moralistic discourse. The people who vote for populists are not innocent. This idea that you have evil populists and then this kind of misguided voters who don't know really what they're voting for, it's very clear they do. Right? Orban gets reelected. Trump lost only a small portion of support. PIS is thriving. They know. And they're fine. Right? But we don't need to demolish them. What we need to do is, first of all, change the narrative. Because the more topics we talk about, the bigger the chance is that I have something in common with you. If we only talk about immigration and security, then the average radical right voter is the absolute opposite of me. But if we talk about education and healthcare or public transport, we might actually be on the same side. So we have to move away from this obsession with culture war issues. And polarization will be stronger because of social media and the way that the media works these days. But it is amplified by having a very narrow political focus and by anti-populism. I hope this answers the questions a bit.
Thank you. Yes, it does to a great extent. We have really enjoyed this conversation. You have made so many important linkages and messages, I think, also applicable in the Western Balkans, in the region where Belgrade Security Forum is taking place, and especially that very last linkage on how we should approach the issue of populist zeitgeist or modern populism, actually by strengthening democratic institutions and not falling into this, let's say, elitist narrative of despising people who might decide to vote for someone who is a populist. We hope to welcome you in person next time around in Belgrade to take you to that football game we've been talking about. Perhaps not for the quality of football, unfortunately, because it's bad, again, unfortunately. But really, we have enjoyed this conversation in, I would say, a new format that we have introduced this year around at the Belgrade Security Forum. That said, I thank you again and invite our viewers to join us again on Tuesday, 27th of October, when we continue the program of the Belgrade Security Forum for the one final day of panels and discussions. Thank you again, Professor Mudde, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the online panel of the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. We will be back soon.